Welcome to the Writers League of Texas podcast, conversations and presentations featuring writers and industry professionals talking about the craft and business of writing. More information about this discussion, including details on our panelists and presenters, can be found at writersleague.org. We hope you enjoy the discussion.
You're here for what makes writing poetic, and I'm just going to go ahead and introduce our panelists, starting from my left. Charlie Clarke's poetry has appeared in New England Review, Plowshares, Three Penny Review, and other journals. He is a 2019-2020 NEA Fellow in Poetry. His book, The Newest Employee of the Museum of Ruin, will be published by Four Way Books in the fall of next year. He lives in Austin, Texas. Please welcome Charlie Clarke. Zoë Fay-Stindt's work has been nominated for the Pushcart Prize and has appeared or is forthcoming in Fields, the Indianapolis Review, Winter Tangerine, and others. Most recently, she was selected as a recipient for the National Gemini Inc. Poetry Mentorship with Barbara Raz. When she's not writing her own poetry, she works for the adult college program in Austin, Free Minds, where she facilitates and supports community writing workshops and helps others strengthen their voices. Please welcome Zoë. Tomás Q. Morín is the author of Patient Zero and A Larger Country, winner of the APR Honickman Prize, and runner-up for the Penn Joyce Osterweil Award. He is co-editor with Marie Lesperance of the anthology Coming Close, 40 Essays on Philip Levine, and translator of The Heights of Machu Picchu by Pablo Neruda. He is at work on a memoir about fathers. He teaches at Drew University and in the low residency MFA program at the Vermont College of Fine Arts. Please welcome Tomás. And last but not least, Alison Whipple is a poet, amateur naturalist, and perpetual student. She is the author of 2 chapbooks, most recently, Come Into the World Like That. She teaches at Austin Community College and serves as executive director of Borderlands, the Texas Poetry Review. Please welcome Alison. So what we're going to do tonight is each of our 4 poets is going to talk about some favorite poems and poets and a little bit about what's going on, and you're going to hear some poetry. I thought we would start with a kind of like really basic question, though, and it was one that was inspired by something that C.D. Wright was writing, and that's a poet we're going to talk about tonight. In her book of essay-ish kinds of things, she keeps saying the phrase, "It's a poem if I say it is." And I remember, like, in the many times that I studied poetry, in college and in graduate school, people would ask this question, what is poetry? And sometimes poetry takes many different forms. Some of them don't really look like what we think of as poetry. And so I guess I would just throw that question out to you to start with, and any of you can start. What is a poem? What makes it not prose?
I have zero answer for that. I feel like I still haven't developed it, and some of my poems have been published as short fiction pieces, so you guys let me know.
I recently fielded that question at the Writers' Retreat in Kerrville, and I told them the story about, it was my first workshop of my MFA, and because I was an uber nerd, I anticipated what would potentially be the hardest question that the teacher would ask on the first day. And the question was, what is a poem? So I had prepared an answer. And the answer that I gave was Ezra Pound's dictum that a poem is a verbal expression of an emotional value. So I threw my hand up, tossed that out, and the teacher was like, well, that's one side of the coin. The other side is the world. And I felt like that was a good place to start.
Everything.
I do think later, or somewhere in this book, C.D. Wright quotes Matthew Arnold saying a poem is a criticism of life also, which I find to be an interestingly also endlessly open kind of answer to what that is. And I think the reason that it's such a hard thing to grapple with is because there are so many contradictory things that can function in poems and be poems. I had it in my mind to mention that same line, "It's a poem if I say it is," from C.D. Wright, because there are a lot of ways in which I think that's true, I also do think that doesn't necessarily mean it's a good poem. You know, you can say that anything is a poem, but you know, that's maybe the first step. Like what's happening in the poem that makes it interesting or successful and worth spending time with is maybe the next question, like a meatier question. But I'm definitely of the mind that almost anything can be a poem if you can justify it as such.
And I think poetry has some sort of either inherent relationship to or against form in a way that prose does not necessarily have. And I mean, the poets I brought to discuss tonight, one is a formalist and one is not. And those are very like two sides of the same coin for me that I've really wrestled with. But like what we think of as the structure of the poem or the container of the poem or even the medium in which the poem is contained, I think that is really important to think about.
Sort of a question that goes hand in hand with this one, which is sort of like, how should we read or approach poetry? You know, Billy Collins has got a famous poem, Introduction to Poetry, and he first begins by saying like how he tells his students to read poetry. But he says what they want to do, he says, all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. And of course, that's often how we're taught in like literature classes. We're going to sort of derive meaning, and we're going to write about theme and symbol and so on. But of course, not all poems lend themselves to that sort of reading, and also that kind of takes the fun out of it. How should one read poetry? And is it different than how one reads any of the thousands of novels that are downstairs, or books of essays, or nonfiction, or anything?
I think the best way to experience a poem for the first time is to have it read to you. So you can experience it and just experience the sound of it. I mean, I think poetry comes from many cultures out of the oral tradition, and I don't think that's forever. However screen-mediated or page-mediated we get, I don't think that's dead. And there's something really wonderful, I think, about being read to, and that's not something that as adults we get, I don't think, very often, but to have a poem read to you or to be able to hear a poem when you experience it for the first time, I think is a really wonderful thing.
You know, we recently had our Agents and Editors Conference. It's a big conference and mostly deals with not poetry. But our keynote speaker was Naomi Shihab Nye, who's a poet who's in San Antonio, and she's super famous and wonderful. And so she gave a speech, but she also sort of like read some poetry. And most of the people in the audience were not poets, were not regular readers of poetry. And they were just knocked out. One, because she's a terrific reader, and also because the poems were really good. Some were hers, some were not. Like having poetry read to you is wonderful. How else? Like how do you, when people encounter poetry, and of course there's always like some poems, like poets we're going to talk about tonight, like Natalie Diaz, some of her stuff's more sort of immediately accessible. Other poets that we're going to talk about tonight, less immediately accessible, including like C.D. Wright. When we're encountering poetry that doesn't read sort of like prose, that is, you know, perhaps requires further readings, what keeps people, or what should keep people from just like stopping to be like, I don't get it?
I think that, I think saying I don't get it is a challenge, right? So the first thing is, I don't understand this. What's going on? Clearly somebody is presenting this as though it is a thing of value or of interest. So if I am presented with a poem that doesn't immediately make sense to me, it says my understanding of the tools that I have to understand the world and make sense of the world need to change. I must change my life, somebody said once, right? So I need to do something to change the way that I am reading, or look not for explanation from the text itself. Look for explanation, but like look for the text to reveal its mysteries or pleasures in a different way than simply going A to Z in the poem. And that may be, seeing, relations from one image to another that are juxtaposed against one another, something like that, that doesn't have a literally explained meaning, but can create a resonance that on first glance may not be immediately present.
I think also there are poems that I still don't understand that I love, and I don't get the meaning of them. And my mom she's also a poet, and she sent me a bunch of voice recordings the other morning of her reading poems to me, which was like such a gift. But she was talking about some of her first poems that she wrote and referred to them as tone poems, which I had never heard of before. And she was like, that's my word. I don't use it officially. But having the idea that a poem can exist Two, for the musicality, for just its space that it takes up on the page, the energy that it brings. It kind of sounds woo-woo, but just the energy of the poem and the tone of the poem, you can still absorb that, I think, even if you don't totally get the meaning. And I find myself doing that a lot.
I really wish we would move away from the conversation of is poetry accessible, is it not accessible, and move towards, like what Charlie was saying, instead start talking about how open are we as readers? You know, how open are we to what, you know, the poems by different poets have to give to us? You know, they're not menus. You know, we're not getting the same kind of, you know, information from them. Sometimes it's just pleasure, right? It's the pleasure of not getting anything.
I think on some level people are kind of afraid to not get it. Like they're I don't know, you went to school and you're like, I have to understand the poem to get an A. And so we're trained like, I have to decode the poem. Sometimes there's nothing to decode. Sometimes it's just a mystery.
Yeah, if there's no way to ever close the door, it lives with you, which is exciting, but that can be confusing. Like at what point does looking at a painting end?
Yeah.
At what point does a poem, like the poem may literally end, but may not actually then be done, and you can go about your day, like it stays with you.
Well, so with that as prelude, let's jump into some actual poetry and just listen to it, and we'll talk about it. And Charlie, since you're to my left, I'll start with you.
Okay.
What do you want to introduce us to?
I definitely wanted to talk about this C.D. Wright poem. What is it? On the back of the book, they call them prosometrical essays, which sounds like a made-up word for we don't know if it's a poem or an essay. But if people aren't familiar with C.D. Wright, she died a couple years ago, but she's an Arkansas poet who sort of started, I think her first book came in about early 80s, writing these sort of like, would call them like Ozark Gothic, sort of dark, gnarly poems that were really interested in voice. And as she continued writing, her sort of tool belt of skills really expanded, and she wound up writing these much larger, I mean, some people call it like docu-poetics. You know, she has a book about going into prisons in Louisiana and sort of observing the lives that people make there. And she did it with the photographer Deborah Luster, who took photos of the scene. But this book itself, the thing that I want to read from it is, the book is called The Poet, the Lion, Talking Pictures, El Farolito, A Wedding in St. Roche, The Big Box Store, The Warp in the Mirror, Spring, Midnight, Fire, and All. And she's a poet who likes lists, which she has given us with the title. But it's, as she continued writing, she became more and more interested in, I think, dropping the distinction between poetry and prose and just sort of writing text, language-based art objects in a way. But she has a sort of consistent, joyful mode of inquiry that sort of moves all over the place that really resonates for me. I brought a couple props that I want to use to make a point. But I'll read the first piece from this first. It's called In a Word, a World, and it's, as those of you can see, you know, it almost looks like a poem. But it's the first of, I don't know, 8 or 9 pieces with this name, this title in the book. And she sort of jumps around back and forth between this and kind of essays on writers and other, like, Mexico and different things. But so here's the first piece. In a word, a world. I love them all. I love that a handful, a mouthful gets you by. A satchelful can land you a job. A well-chosen clutch of them can get you laid. And that a solitary word can initiate a stampede and therefore can be formally outlawed, even by a liberal court bent on defending a constitution guaranteeing unimpeded utterance. I love that the Argentine gaucho has over 200 words for the coloration of horses, and the Sami language of Scandinavia has over 1,000 words for reindeer based on age, sex, appearance, e.g., a busat has big balls or only one ball. More than the pristine, I love the filthy ones for their descriptive talent as well as transgressive nature. I love the dirty ones more than the minced, in that I respect extravagant expression more than reserved. I admire reserve, especially when taken to an aesthetic nth. I love the particular lexicons of particular occupations, the substrate of those activities, the nomenclatures within nomenclatures. I am of the unaccredited school that believes animals did not exist until Adam assigned them names. My relationship to the word is anything but scientific. It is a matter of faith on my part that the word endows material substance by setting the thing named apart from all else. Horse, then, unhorses what is not horse. So, I mean, there are so many things that I really love about her work, and this piece in particular. I think that I'm going to a little bit consider like what makes it poetry and not and whatever, but also just sort of talk about it in and of itself and the things that I'm attracted to in writing. And I think that what she does really well, a lot of things, but there's a real ingratiating tone that I mean, it's ingratiating. It invites you sort of into the idea of what she's talking about. But she so quickly goes to so many different places in the poem that are unexpected and surprising. And I think it's something that, I really look to try to achieve in my own writing. I often will, I'll get an idea and start a poem, and at the beginning think, okay, this is where I am. My goal is to get as far away from this as possible, while still nominally staying within the rubric that I have set for myself. And I think, this is a poem that, it has a thesis statement in many ways, the title being In a Word, a World, like words help make the world, and then I love them all being the first line. Clearly she has a subject, and everything within is, in an essayistic way, backing up what that thesis is. But the way that she allows herself to sort of move around through all of these things and make these quick movements from the Argentine gaucho to the Sami language, and the way that she even enacts some of the things that she's describing in the poem, that immediately after the joke about a Busat has big balls or only one big ball, to I love the filthy ones for their descriptive talent, that she's commenting on what she's doing there. So it's sort of enacting this this kind of pleasure that she's herself interested in, and then I find myself interested in as well. The one thing that I brought props for. So the book that really I got interested in her work through is her selected poem Steal Away, and there is an early poem in there called Scratch Music, and looks like a poem, right? So I discovered her work mostly through this book. So found this book, really fell in love with it, and some years later, I found a copy of the book Further Adventures with You that poem comes from. And when I got to that poem, I was shocked to find that it was a block of prose. And I said, wait, what? What's going on here? And I went so far as to actually email Copper Canyon, the publisher, to say, so what is the deal? And they didn't answer. But I think that, or I want to believe, not having an answer, I've decided to supply my own, that C.D. Wright eventually became disinterested enough in the idea of, or wanting to blur the distinction or diminish the distinction between prose and poetry, to the point that she made a conscious decision then to have like rag Wright in her later books, and to take something that had been specifically like a prose block and make it something rag Wright. And it's a nominal distinction, like the words are still there, but it sort of points to a permeability between these two different kinds of writing. And I mean, she doesn't consistently do it, and in this book that she does, but there's a later book that actually just came out recently where she does have justified prose. So it seems like there's a conscious decision going on there where she wants to say, you take this for what it is, but it's the word, the words and the ideas are the crucial thing that I want to get across here.
Zoe?
I'll just jump right into my Bible, Kaveh Akbar's Calling a Wolf a Wolf. He is an Iranian-American poet, and I've just been totally smitten with him for the last few years of my life. And he's writing now, and he's recently recovered from alcoholism, so this first collection is kind of a recovery narrative. And I'm going to read the last poem, And what I love about Akbar's work is that he is a total student of delight. He just follows delight everywhere he goes and is trying to figure it out and figure out how to get it down on the page. And I was listening to a lecture of his recently, and he was talking about how what he asks of poems now is what is bewildering them. So what's bewildering this poem? And he's sure that every poem has something that it's bewildered by, which I really love. And that kind of is another idea of how to look at a poem is, what's really caught this poem. I won't lie, this plague of gratitude is hard to bear. I was comfortable in my native pessimism, not this spun sugar fantasy. Last night I made actual cake. There were no worms in the flour, no bloody whirls in the eggs. Afterwards, the minor holiday below my waistband remained festive as ever. When I touched 2 breasts, each one was my favorite. Not long ago, I was hard to even hug like ribbons of cartilage cut from a lamb. I dressed in shredded roses and pistachio shells. I drank an entire language and flung tar at whatever moved until the world cut me open like a tube of paint, until it crushed me between its fingers like a hornet. None of it was graceful. I had to learn to love people one at a time, singing, "Hey, diddle diddle, will you suffer me a little?" How could they say no? How could they say anything? I kept biting their tongues. I kept clicking my heels. Now I am cheery and Germanic like a drawer full of strudel. I always wanted to be a saint, but I thought I'd be one of the miserable ones, sainted by pain, burnt alive inside a brazen bull. Instead, I weep openly at obnoxious beauty. Cello music comes in from blocks away, and I lose it completely. There is a word for these fits of incomprehensible delight. I said it last night when my mouth was full of cake. I mean, he's totally bewildered by delight, the whole collection. It's a pretty painful collection. It's intense and it's full of jumps and leaps and it's really vulnerable. And what he ends up with is delight and is cake, and cake without worms or bloody whirls in the eggs. I just love it. And he's famous. He's famous in my mind for saying, always talking about how trees are these things that are getting light from a star billions of miles away and turning it into sugar so that they can live. And how amazing is that? And that art, the purpose of art is to undo the damage of habituation. And I love that idea of using art to take away what we have just become totally accustomed to return, I think he's quoting Horace in this, but to return to the stone, its stoniness, to really get the thing and bring it on the page and make the reader see it for all of its beauty and all of its crazy delight. And I love how he does that too. And what I try to take specifically from his writing is his ability to leap. I like what you were talking about starting with something and trying to get as far away from it as possible. And I feel like he does that really well. He starts with this thing and he always manages to orbit it, but still brings us in these crazy places. I mean, we're going from cake to cartilage cut from a lamb to Germanic like a drawer full of strudel, and somehow still getting the same thing.
Yeah, it's funny. That was the line about the strudel that stuck out to me. Because I was like, I did not see that one coming.
No.
And also, but it does
What?
fit when you think about it. I mean, you're like,
Yeah,
oh my
yeah,
God.
yeah.
I mean,
Cake, strudel?
yeah, but very surprising. Tomás.
So I brought a poem called Ode to the Beloved's Hips, and it's by Natalie Diaz. She has, her second book is due out, I think, in 2020. It's called Post-Colonial Love Poem. Ode to the Beloved's Hips. Bells are they, shaped on the 8th day, silvered percussion in the morning, are the morning. Swing, switch, sway, hold the day away a little longer, a little slower, a little easy. Call to me. I want to rock. I want to rock. I want to rock right now. So to them, I come. struck dumb, chime blind, tolling with a throat full of Hosanna. How many hours bowed against this infinity of blessed trinity, communion of pelvis, sacrum, femur, my mouth, terrible angel, everlasting novena, ecstatic devourer. Oh, the places I have laid them, knelt and scooped the amber, fast honey from their openness. Ah, Musin Cab's hidden temple of Tulum, licked smooth the sticky of her hip, heat-thrummed ossa coxae, lambent slave to ilium and ischium. I never tire to shake this wild hive, split with thumb the sweet-dripped comb, hot hexagonal hole, dark diamond to its nectar dervished queen. Menad tongue, cum drunk, hum-tranced, honey puller, for her hips, I am, strummed song and succubus. They are the sign, hip, and the cosign, a great book, the body's Bible opened up to its good news gospel. Alleluias, Ave Marias, Madre Mias, ay ay ay's, ay Dios míos, and hip hip hooray. Cult of coccyx, culto de cadera, oracle of orgasm, Rorschach's riddle. What do I see? Hips. Innominate bone, wishbone, Orpheus bone, transubstantiation bone, hips of bread, wine-wet thighs. Say the word and healed I shall be. Bone butterfly, bone wings, bone Ferris wheel, bone basin, bone throne, bone lamp, apparition in the bone grotto. Sixth mystery, slick rosary bead, deme la gracia of a decade in this garden of carmine flower. Exile me to the enormous orchard of Alcinous, spiced fruit, laden tree, in paradise me, because, God, I am guilty, I am sin-frenzied and full of teeth for pear upon apple upon fig. More than all that are your hips. They are a city, they are a kingdom. Troy, the hollowed horse, an army of desire, 30 soldiers in the belly, 2 in the mouth. Beloved, your hips are the war. At night your legs, love, are boulevards, leading me beggared and hungry to your candy house, your Baroque mansion. Even when I am late and the tables have been cleared in the kitchen of your hips, let me eat cake. Oh, constellation of pelvic glide, every curve, a luster, a star, more infinite still. Your hips are cosmic, our universe, galactic carousel of burning comets and big, big bangs. Millennium Falcon, let me be your solo. Oh, hot planet, let me circumambulate. Oh, spiral galaxy, I am coming for your dark matter. Along las calles de tus muslos I wander, follow the parade of pulse like a drumline, descend into your Plaza del Toros, hands throbbing Miura bulls, dark isleros, your arched hips, ay mi torera. Down the long corridor, your wet walls lead me like a traje de luces, all glitter, glowed. I am the animal born to rush your rich red muletas. Each breath, each sign, each groan, a hooked horn of want. My mouth at your inner thigh. Here I must enter you, mi pobre manolete. Press and part you like a wound. Make the crowd pounding in the grandstand of your iliac crest rise up in you and cheer.
The bar has been raised for anybody who wants to say something nice to their significant other.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. I feel like this poems like this, a poem like this, in a time in which people chant "send her back," rather than yell back or chant back, we should read poems like this. I feel like to write a love poem like this, in particular for a person of color, is a radical political act. Even more in particular if you are a queer person of color, because the times and people kind of demand that we write political poems, but poems that celebrate the body, that celebrate not just the beloved's body, but also the fact that bodies have histories. They have recent histories, and our bodies also carry long ago histories. The different things that she, invokes in here. The hidden temple of Tulum. Her beloved's body is both contemporary and ancient, and
a mix of languages as well, right? There was Spanish and
there's
Latin.
there's Spanish in there. There's Latin.
Yeah.
Mix of cultures. It's yeah, it's just a phenomenal poem. And I can't wait for her, like I said, her book, Post-Colonial Love Poem, to come out, which this is in there.
You know, pick up on the phrase that Zoe used, a student of delight.
I thought you were going to say the cake.
No, the cake was in there too,
The cake
right?
was in there too.
Yeah, actual cake.
Because cake is nice. It is delightful. So, student of delight, and that this is a poem, and all these poems are not, but certainly that one, it's sort of overt in terms of like just the playing with language and playing with words and putting them together, because in some sense they just sound fun,
Sure, yeah.
pleasurable to hear together. All the alliteration and the assonance and those things that we learn sort of in grade school, but then to hear them done in sort of like a very sort of exuberant way, it's just fun to listen to.
I feel like if no one in the audience understood English and they heard me read that poem, they would derive pleasure just from hearing it, and would probably have a good sense of, what the tone, like the emotional temperature, of the poem was.
Alison.
How do you follow up with that one?
It better have cake in it.
There's no. Well, actually, I could read one about cake. So one of the books I wanted to bring tonight was Barbara Hamby's All Night Lingo Tango, which is, she's written other books since then, but this one had a huge impact on me. This is not going to trans well to the podcast, but this is very annotated and color coded, and this is a very influential book to me. I have a very casual relationship to form, but at one point I really wanted to understand it, and Barbara Hamby is very much a formalist, so I sat down and just about every poem in this book, I sat down and tried to just, it was really interesting for me to not just enjoy the poems, but really sit down and mark up with a little colored pencil, what is this doing? How is this working? What are the mechanics of this? And now I'm like, should I read the one about cake? I'll actually read my favorite one from the book. There are sort of two styles of poems in this book, medium to long form rhymed poems, many of which are odes, and then short 13-line, what are called abecedarian sonnets, in which they're actually 13-line sonnets, but the beginning and end of each line is dictated by a letter of the alphabet. I'll read one of the longer rhyming poems, she's a formalist, and she's very, very dense on her cultural allusions, and I think she's very funny. So this is called Mambo Cadillac. Drive me to the edge in your Mambo Cadillac. Turn left at the graveyard and gas that baby, the black night ringing with its holy roller scream. I'll clock you on the highway at 3 a.m., brother. Amen. Smack the road as hard as we can, because I'm going to crack the world in two. Make a hoodoo soup with chicken necks, a gumbo with plutonium roux, a little snack before the dirt and jalapeno stew that will shuck the skin right off your slinky hips. Mr. I'm not stuck in a middle-class prison with someone I hate sack of blues. Put on your high-wire shoes, Mr. Wright, and stick with me. I'm going nowhere fast, the burlesque queen of this dim scene. I want to feel the wind, the Glock in my mouth, going south, down by the riverside, shock of the view. Take me to Shingles Fried Chicken Shack in your Mambo Cadillac. I was gone, but I'm back for good this time. I've taken a shine to daylight. Crank up that radio, baby. Put on some dance music and shake your moneymaker doll. Rev it up to Mach 2. I'm talking to you, Mr. Magoo. Sit up. Check out that blonde with the leopard print tattoo. Oh, she'll lick the sugar right off your donut and bill you too. Speak French while she do the do. Parlez-vous français? So pick me up tonight at 10 in your Mambo Cadillac, 'cause we got a date with the devil. So fill the tank with high-octane rhythm and blues, sugarcane and shark bait too. We got some miles to cover, me and you. Think Chile, Argentina, Peru. Take some time off work. We're going to be gone longer than a week or two. Is this D-Day or Waterloo? White or black? It's up to you. We'll be in Mexico tonight. Pack a razor, pack some glue. Things fall apart off the track, and that's where we'll be, baby, in our Mambo Cadillac. 'Cause you're looking for love, but I'm looking for a wreck. So there's end rhyme, there's internal rhyme. The whole thing is full of rhyme, and it was very I've really been thinking about this, because about a year ago someone asked me very seriously, why are you so obsessed with form? Which I thought was a very weird question, because I don't write in, like, I write like an occasional sonnet. I don't really write in form. I write a lot of like tercets and quatrains, and I keep fairly even line lengths, but I don't really consider myself a formalist. But to me, really, a relationship to form is part of the poetry. And this person asked me, who's like, form isn't natural. I'm like, but it is. Not always, but if you think of, the sort of metaphor I use is if you've ever looked at like a seashell that has a golden ratio in it, like that's form. So definitely there's parts of nature that are certainly wild and unstructured, but certainly there's also form to be found in a lot of things. And so that's one of the things that's really important to me in poetry, and that I always really value. And as Zoe knows, I was on the poetry calendar team with her. She's like, "You're always here for the sonnets."
She's like, every time we read a poem, I'd be like, that's interesting. She was like, it's this form. I've got it. I was like, okay, all right, just a dictionary.
Yeah, but I really like something, from my aesthetic, something in me really responds to structure or lack thereof. And I think in many ways that rebelling against form is not inherently anti-formal, because how you need the form for there to be a rebellion against it. And in some way, the rebellion is in a way its own form of constraint.
One of the things all those poems seem to have in common is speed, right? So like you had talked about, Charlie, about, the world, right? So you're going to leap from thing to thing to thing. And certainly in that poem, you've got Chicken and Mr. Magoo and like the Cadillacs and all that. But it's like the speed with which it moves from one thing to another, which I suppose is possible in prose, but more difficult because, for lots of reasons, you have to sort of like lead the reader along. And in a poem, like you can sort of blow past the reader, and I guess they can just go back and catch back up and read it again. How much of that, when you're all writing poetry, how much of that speed comes through the revision? Like, are your brains sort of like piling all this together, and it's just like, bam, we'll just put it on the page, and it's going to move fast? Or is it more plodding and methodical, and then you start sort of cutting stuff out so that you can, get that sense of those quick leaps from one thing to another?
Well, in terms of my own sort of drafting process, there's definitely a lot of throw a lot on, take a lot away, throw a lot on, take a lot away. These days, the way that I tend to write is I actually just accumulate words. Literally, I steal words. Like I'll see the word like vermilion in a book, and I go, I'm gonna put that in my phone. And then like after a few weeks, I've got 50 words in my phone. I throw them on a page and go, okay, what are these? What do they have in relationship to one another? What's going on here? Which, I think inevitably, like, I want to trust that, like, there are certain things that I am attracted to that are, around the same time there's a reason why those words want to be together. But I definitely think that I will frequently have a moment where I go, oh, this third line is actually the beginning, because it sort of cuts through something and has a clear declarative intent or a real surprise to it, or there's an assurance to it that negates whatever preamble led to it in terms of the composition. And it's valuable in terms of the composition, but once you get to whatever that line is, it renders what it took to get there not as necessary.
That's the famous Ezra Pound poem, right, about the station of the metro. Wasn't that originally like it's 2 lines, but it was originally like 40 lines or 60 lines or a million, and then it got cut down, right?
Yeah, Richard Sykin who's a contemporary poet, has in his most recent book, The War of the Foxes, has a poem that is, I think, 7 lines long, and it at one point had been like 8 or 9 pages, and he, accordioned it back and forth until he said, no, these 7 lines will do. Yeah.
Other thoughts in terms of like revision, your own process?
I think maybe about 10 years ago, I got to a place where, I used to, when I was an MFA student, I used to do a full first draft and then start revising that second, third, and so on. And then eventually I got to a place, I'm not sure, like I don't quite understand why my revision process changed. I feel like it's probably better not to understand it too closely, but I got to a place where I was revising on the level of the line as I was also composing. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't go on to line 2 until line 1 was set. And I wouldn't go on to line 3 until 1 and 2 were set. So by the time I got to, and each time I would resave the document in Microsoft Word. So maybe the poem would be titled, first one would be Sing Sing 1, right, and then Sing Sing 2. And then by the time that I got to a full draft, it was like Sing Sing 85. And so I kept resaving it as I was going along. And so by the time I would get to a first full draft, it was actually kind of like a 10th draft because I'd been doing so much work on, line by line as I was going along. I'm not sure why that happened. It also meant that poems would come very fast. Mm-hmm. So it'd be like 10 drafts worth of writing within like a day and a half.
Mm-hmm. Do you find then when you get to Sing Sing 85 that you're still in a place where, this sentence or this image or this idea makes more sense, that currently it's in line 47, it needs to be at line 23? Or at this point, or at Sing Sing 85, have you fairly well conceived of the structure and the movement of the poem, that you're not making those kinds of great restructuring revisions?
Like the overall structure is usually pretty set.
Mm-hmm.
If it's not, then I'll go through so this style isn't working. So maybe I'll try it in, I don't know, the style of Elizabeth Bishop's End of March. So I'll recast it in that and then resave it. And if that doesn't work, or it doesn't feel right, then I'll try it in, William Stafford's Driving into the Dark. So then the poem will shrink, incredibly. So I'll just go through style after style, Hopkins and Keats and Levine and blah, 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 until eventually the final sort of version ends up being like a mishmash, running it through all those filters. They're kind of like filters, helps kind of clean out all of the stuff that just doesn't need to be there.
I'm really glad you mentioned your process changing, because I think that's a thing that I've encountered a lot of people who are very resistant to their process changing over time. Or I was doing it this way for 5 years and now it's not working anymore and I'm failing as a writer, and no. I mean, I think, if your process isn't changing, I guess there's probably some people who will do the same thing every day for 40 years and that works, and cool, rock on. But I think for most of us, if your process isn't changing at least a little bit over time, then what are you doing? I think changes to our process are part of our continued growth and inspiration and knowledge. So, I'm glad you mentioned that your process has evolved over time. I know for me, my revision style, it sort of depends on the poem a lot. But one method that when it's one that I'm I'm onto something here, is I'll sort of write it part of the way and I'll get stuck, and then I'll stop, and then I'll go away for a while, and then I'll come back and just start writing it again until I stop, and it'll get a little longer, and then start over, and so maybe a little in the vein of you do, but I don't really go line by line. I just sort of go chunk by chunk and then start rewriting from the beginning until it's done.
I feel like also there are a few poems that I've written that have been speedy, and those are always what I call gift poems that just come out, and so that speed is kind of born into them too. Yeah, I sometimes write it back into the poem, but often I'm angry, or I woke up with a cockroach in my body once, and so I wrote a very fast poem because I was very angry.
Speed would seem to be of the essence in all parts of that, right?
Yes.
One of the things that is mentioned in the description of this panel that was out on Facebook and so on was sort of the connection of prose and poetry. And sometimes people will say oh, it's so poetic, and usually what they mean is it's lyric in a kind of way, but of course lyric applies very loosely, or maybe not at all, to some of what we've heard tonight so far. But it does occur to me that some of what you say in terms of the delight of language and the leaps is often, and the bewilderment is often, much of what we take pleasure in fiction and nonfiction as well. Even in plot-driven sort of crime novels, dialogue tends to be what's most pleasurable, and the dialogue is very fast and often makes huge leaps. And so I find myself as a fiction writer, I'm not a poet, listening to everything that you're saying, oh, this makes perfect sense. I would love to do this myself. Charlie, you're very much nodding.
I'm right there with you, yeah. Yeah, I'm trying to think of the poet, the fiction writer George V. Higgins. He wrote crime novels, and there's the Friends of something something, and I can't remember it exactly, but the book is almost entirely just dialogue, just voices, and you don't exactly know who is saying what, but as the book accumulates, you get a sense of who the characters are and what their motivations are. And God, I wish I could remember the full name of the book. It's an amazing book. The Friends of anybody?
George V. Higgins. We'll go find it
Yeah.
afterward.
But yeah, I mean, I think that obviously, pleasure is a big part of what we're doing or what we're going for when we're reading.
Mhm.
Certainly for me when I'm writing, be it a novel or a poem or a book of essays. I think, was it David Foster Wallace who said something about like the pleasure of like the well-made box snapping shut, that like he sort of knew when something was done when he could sort of feel the well-made box snapping
Mhm.
shut in terms of the thing that he's created. So yeah, I don't think that what we're talking about is exclusive by any means to poetry. I do think that the term poetic, that there's a way in which it almost I feel like there's poetic and then there's like what poetry does, and that those can be two very different things. That poetic can be a part of it, and maybe like poetic, what people mean by that is something like the priorities of beauty have overtaken sense-making priorities or something.
Mm-hmm.
That like you are in something and you're like, this is pleasurable and I don't totally understand it, but it's beautiful and fun, as opposed to something that is sort of explaining itself to you. I don't know. I'm sort of grasping here, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that that's something that is limited to a particular genre or style of writing. Friends of Eddie Coyle, yes. It was also made into a movie in the 80s.
Well, and Tomás, so you're working on a memoir as well, which you mentioned in the bio. And then, of course, I haven't read it yet, so I can't ask you anything about it, but like one of the sort of hottest literary novels of the moment is On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong, who is quite well known as a poet. But this is a novel. And of course, like just flipping through it, like the shape of it is perhaps more poetic in terms of like short sections, but it's still a novel. Tomás, how much of this does this transfer over to your process as you work on a memoir?
Well, I feel like I'm in a pretty advantageous position in the sense that I've always been a narrative poet. I tell stories in my poems. So from my MFA days, I've always been interested in character development, plot, scene setting, dialogue as well, points of view, all these things. My first book is almost entirely made up of persona poems. So in that sense, I feel like I was pretty primed in terms of where my mind was in terms of the composition process. What I was not prepared for was the stamina that it takes to go to the desk and write work on one project for years. I mean, I think at least I find it pleasurable. One pleasurable thing that we poets have over prose writers is that we get to experience a lot more beginnings, because the canvas of what we tend to work on is very small. So there's a lot of endings and there's a lot of beginnings. I mean, I have prose writer friends who labor on one project for 7 years, and then they start something else. Over the course of that 7 years, I've written many poems. I've had lots of beginnings, but so the stamina, right? I had to work on that, and I actually approached that in a very sort of practical way. Like I started doing more cardio. I tried to eat better, go to sleep earlier, so that way I could be physically fit enough to endure the sitting, so that my mind could be free to just work on the page, and I wouldn't have to be worrying about a backache or whatever.
Well, I mean, the Japanese novelist Haruki Murakami's got an entire book about running a marathon as like both literally and
Right.
It's a metaphor for writing, but he also is a marathon runner.
What I talk about when I talk about running, that's a great memoir. Yeah, so all that, like I wasn't prepared for that. I've written long poems, but I mean, we're talking about thousands and thousands of words, tens of thousands of words, and even saying it out loud, it's like, what am I doing? But no, it's helped to have like trusted readers, who are willing to commit and to volunteer. Because I feel like before I could ask someone, hey, could you look at this new poem I just drafted? And 10 minutes later, I get an email back. But I can't say, hey, can you take a look at this memoir I just drafted? So I've been lucky, in that sense. To have friends who help out with that.
So I think that each of you have another poem to talk about. Why don't this time we'll start from the other end. Allyson, if you want to begin. And we'll come through and talk about poems, and we'll throw it open to questions from the audience for a little bit, and then we'll all applaud uproariously.
So the other poet I brought was Rachel Zucker, and I brought two of her books because I'm very indecisive. And I was like, I don't know which one I want to read from. But Bad Wife Handbook, which it's a little older, but again holds a very special place in my heart. And she's not totally, anti-formal, but this is not shaped like all of the other books on this table or any of the other books back there. And there are many poems in here that are just very they don't even look like prose. They're sort of lineated more densely like prose, but they're so long that they don't look like a novel. I think this was the first poetry book that I ever really read that looked like that. And there are a lot of really long poems in this book. So I'm going to read just an excerpt from a multi-page poem called Squirrel in a Palm Tree. It doesn't really have section numbers. It's delineated by little symbols like a bracket. So I'll maybe hold it in my hand to delineate a section. And by way of that, Squirrel in a Palm Tree excerpts. Bracket. Up out of the sentry box over the parapet, bastion, rampart, breastwork. Don't think I have left them. Draw and look, lift, erase, draw and lift and lift and lift and lift. An erasable slate, the vellum top sheet takes away, left them. Up over the country. The edge of the coast and further out the clouds like stones in deep waters, a river delving the lush green marsh, an amorphous rum baba soaked and spongy, grasses and cattails misstate the surface. The cabin has a sharp inhale of opening a gift. High ceiling, blue, and pink and gray striped walls shape me, make a naked Alice in the bath, big and tiny here and far away. A wonder the body fits so mythic in the mother abstentia, tundra of abandon. I suffer the gift. Silence. For once, nothing happened. None using my name to mean anything. Bed as wide as it is long. The night in human calm. The outlets and picture frames and decorative plates are safe. The bathtub and mirror and doors and linens. I am light as negligee, having not my army's entourage. On Sunday, I will step back into the living room littered with toys, the two boys happy/shy/mad to see me. But like I dawdled in the shower, like I never was anywhere but ready to answer, where is my, can't find the, look here, the light through the sycamores and dense magnolias, live oaks tasked with Spanish moss, a veranda you reach through a 12-foot window. Be real. This goes on for 8 more pages, and it's beautiful, but I want to save time for everyone else's. But I really love that piece. Of course, I picked something super challenging to read. I'm like, how do I represent brackets? Good job. But I love the way she uses space in that poem, because Rachel Zucker writes so much from the perspective of being a mother, which is interesting because I don't have kids, but I've always been very drawn to the way she really represents and writes about being a mother in a way that is honest and yet still very careful to respect her son's privacy, and the way she approaches space in this poem that is about being away from her children for a few days, the way that space is really conveyed on the page, even though it's certainly not rhymed and metered and structured like a Barbara Hamby poem. The way she uses that takes up space on the page really draws attention to the themes of the poem.
So the second poem is by, it's also an ode. It's called Ode to the Heart by James Arthur. I know it's the brain, not you, that loves or fails to love. You don't turn cold over time. You don't grow fonder. But if I needed reminding of what I have in common with the ibis or the snail, the narwhal or the tiger, I could slip my hand inside my shirt and feel you at my core, a clockwork fist clenching and unclenching, lumping out your truth, survive, survive, survive. These valentines that at best approximate your form, you're blind to them, and to the star-crossed lovers who only speak their lines and die. You don't care whether poems rhyme, whether poets of yesteryear used up the mountains and trademarked the sea. You're indifferent to poetry. At times, mid-conversation, I feel you inside me, poised for flight, a prehistoric bird, hungry to prey and ravage. Other times, I think you are talking to me from your cage, instructing me. If I know what I'm doing, I'm not doing it right. One of the things I love about this poem is that it's very anti-romantic. It's an anti-love poem. It sets you up, ode to the heart. You are expecting everything that he is kind of lampooning here, but he's not just lampooning it. I mean, I love the sort of like scientific grounding, of you have the narwhal, you have the ibis in here. He talks about how hearts don't really look like, right, the way in which we represent them on Valentine's. But at the same time, it's a like the emotion runs so deep. Like, this is a Valentine, right? Which is ironic, right? It's a Valentine. It's an anti-Valentine Valentine to the muscle that is the heart. And I chose both of these poems, not just because I love the poems and I love the poets, but both of these are from books that are soon to be out. So James Arthur's second collection, The Suicide's Son, came out in Canada, I think, earlier this year. It's about to come out in the U.S. In a few months. And back in 2013, when myself and Natalie and James were all very young first book poets, we went on a book tour of the West Coast and read from our first books. And I couldn't be more excited that their second books are about to hit bookshelves. So this is my attempt to try to please go and pre-order and plug their books. They're phenomenal.
One of the things that both of those last two poems did was repeat one word multiple times, which, I mean, it's not impossible in prose, but it's certainly more difficult because you're sort of confined usually by basically like syntactical logic, right, grammar. And in a poem, you don't have to be. You can do whatever you want. And if you want to repeat lift multiple times, or I forget which word. Survive, you can do it because it sounds great.
Although in James's poem, like the survive, it's it's meant to approximate the sound of the heart, right? It's that, you have survive, those, that beat, right? That beat of the heart.
Zoe?
And hopping back a bit to Rachel Zucker, if y'all want more geeky conversations about poetry, you should listen to her podcast Commonplace, which is where I get all of my mediocre ideas from. But they're really
It's
good.
the best poetry podcast
It's so good.
ever.
The best.
And Allyson had a shout out for being a
Patron.
Wait,
Yeah, it's
can you repeat the name of that podcast?
Commonplace podcast with Rachel Zucker. It's just very long conversations with poets, which is my favorite thing in the world. So it's really good. I brought Daylily Called It a Dangerous Moment by Alessandra Lynch. She was recently here at Malvern, and I had already fallen in love with this book, which one of my mentors had told me to read, and then she read it for us that night, and I was just sobbing the whole time, and it was really beautiful. But she she wrote this collection, which the entire thing unpacks her one experience of sexual assault in a parking lot. And the whole collection, I mean, it's 100+ pages, just really cracks it open. And I think that's something that poetry does, that there's a recursiveness in it that's circling the same thing that brings new things to light that I really want to do in my work. And I don't know, there's something that I find really magical about not abandoning the subject that kind of brings new stuff to light. And yeah, and I think also in her work there's a departure. There's truth. There's more truth in here than maybe Stone Cold Facts would bring, but there's a departure from that strictness that fiction or memoir might limit her to. So there's kind of more looseness in that. I'm gonna read Would Have Lowered. It's hard to pick one poem from this collection because they all really speak to each other. And when she read them, at least at Malvern, she selected several different pieces and read them chronologically without pausing in between them. And so that's kind of how the collection, I think, should be read, is just through it. Would Have Lowered. Your body ribboned by strobe, your hips fluidly blue in the shafts, face quartered by light, wrists slashed by the green threads of it, shouldered bronzed, in the glow of disregard, half-lidded eye, perfect interior repose, your pelvis tilting, dipping its axis in all that gloss in all that flat light of his knife, the window dropping its blinds, your body felled swiftly from its dance. I could have taken your hand. I could have led you like a moonlit horse beyond shadowy bars, beyond paddock, beyond what had harnessed you, what had wrenched your jaw, lamed your tongue. I would have lowered you to earth, beyond myrtle, rhododendron, cyclamen. I would have lowered you there, away from the light that dismantled you. This is in a club before the sexual assault took place, and I love how she turns color and nightclub into this incredibly dangerous thing that's on the page. And I love also throughout the collection how she moves between herself as human and herself kind of becoming the natural world. And I think that's part of how she wrestles the sexual assault that she experienced in the poems is through that. And that's something that I think poetry allows, is moving between the real in that way into this very not factual world, but that again is kind of more truthful in a way.
Charlie?
I was just thinking of Werner Herzog as you were reading that. He's a famous filmmaker who makes documentaries in which he will frequently break from truth, or he will arrange things in a way that might seem like a no-no, but he refers to it as what he is creating is an ecstatic truth, and I feel like there's a certain liberation that he has given himself, that he has licensed in doing that I think speaks to some of what was going on there. Okay, so the poem that I'm going to read is by the Somali-born poet Leighton Osman. She's got a couple books out. One just came out recently. This is not in it. I just happened to find this on poets.org 6 weeks ago. Yeah, Exiles of Eden is her new book.
I'm gonna hold this one up because the cover is quite striking.
It's an excellent book. Yeah, and this is nowhere in it. So if you really like this, don't look there for it, but go get it anyway because there's plenty of great stuff in it. And I think I brought this because as much as I love CD Wright and poems that sort of structurally push against the notion of what a poem can be, a lot of my own writing and a lot of what I'm really drawn to is poetry that adheres to the line and is interested in what will recognizably fall within the strictures of a poem. And I think I went to CD Wright in part because we were talking about the connection between prose and poetry and what the difference is. This is very much a poem and doesn't really push against that, nor does it need to. It's called The Scalps of the Women with the Best Prophecies Are Dry This Season, which I think is just an amazing title. And I think I was so drawn to it from the title, from Jump Street, because I don't understand totally what's going on in that. And I think that there's something inherent in the idea of prophecy that, like, you're telling people something that doesn't make sense if you're prophesizing. Maybe I'll just read the whole poem instead of talking about it. It's called The Scalps of the Women with the Best Prophecies Are Dry This Season. They grow too aware of crowns, spend evenings rinsing and rinsing, water boiled with oils and herbs left to cool alongside chicken and grains. The women send their children to work on themselves or the house and steam their scalps. I dream of my father, but don't know what he says. It's kind. I share rice and other grains with a man. I hand him light in my kitchen. He takes it and my belly cools. I prefer not to write about love. I prefer not to write about the body. My father's love, my mother's body. Both regenerate with astounding speed. At times, I find myself in an ancient pose. In a cafe, I make my arms a bow and look up, as if an arrow will appear at an absurd angle. I mark a line from privacy to throat, trace the dark line under my belly button. Maybe someone took my astral baby. Maybe I birthed the man who denied me. Maybe he had to deny me to avoid a crime. I don't point my fingers. I'm convinced our fate is determined in part by water, that we can't avoid walking by or being near a body of it, however we plan our travel, that showers are prescribed before birth. How many things have I missed, letting my wet bangs touch my eyelashes, singing into a stream? So it's a poem that I think does a lot of things. I think the way that she sort of presents this idea, this confusing sort of mysterious idea of the scalps of women with the best prophecies are dry this season in the title, is really inviting, because I want to make sense of what all the different balls she's sort of thrown in the air there. I don't totally understand them yet. And I think that I don't totally understand the poem still, even though I've read it a bunch of times now. But there's an assurance and a sort of like sedimentary accretion of information and images in the poem that sort of legitimize their relationship to one another by being in the poem. And there are places, like in particular, that I prefer not to write about love, I prefer not to write about my body, my father's love, my mother's body, both regenerate with astounding speed, that the way that the information is revealed there I find particularly interesting. The move from I prefer not to write about my body, period, my mother's body, my father's love, comma, my mother's body, and then both regenerate with astounding speed. There's a way in which like it's almost like I'm about to fall, and then like in terms of like my confusion, and then like it explains itself to me with the both regenerate with astounding speed, like why the prior line is there. But yeah, it's a poem that I think does a very good job of not totally explaining itself, but having a real assurance line by line of presenting you with something naughty and mysterious that you can sort of turn over in your mind and come back to.
Well, and it seems to illustrate, with the love body part, the Whitman's super famous line about, I contradict myself, therefore I contradict myself.
Yeah.
Which is wonderful.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that there's real license in that. I mean, I remember hearing that for the first time and going, oh, I don't always have to agree with myself. I can say something, and then I can later make a completely different claim, and that's okay. Everybody does that.
All right, we have time for a couple of questions. So I'm going to come around sort of Montel style with the mic. And so just raise your hand if you want to ask something, and I'll come around. That way we can get your question amplified.
I'm not a poet, but I always hear that one of the toughest things when you're writing a novel, for example, is how to know when it's finished. How do you know when your poem's finished?
Philip Levine once said he knew a poem was finished when the moment he started making it worse. I think that's kind of, a good gauge.
Yeah, and I know well-published poets who go into bookstores and write in their books and change their poems. So I don't know. I don't know that they're done.
That's why I like baking, because when you're baking, like, you know when it's done.
Yeah.
You know when a steak is done.
Yeah. I think I was at a Galway Canal poetry reading years ago, and he was reading from his revised selected poems. And he had famously revised all these poems before including them in it. And when people were going up afterwards to have their books signed, he would go into each one and change lines. And he had published it once, and then revised it, published it again in this, and he was still not satisfied. Somebody said poems are never finished; they're abandoned. I can't remember who said that, but I think that there's some truth to that. I think that something that Tomás was saying earlier about having one of the benefits of being a poet is that there are a lot of starts and a lot of endings. It makes it easier for me to, have like between 3 and 75 poems going in at a given time. And going, 6 months ago I removed a comma from something. But I think, like the point when I fully invested my imagination in something else is the point when I think, I guess that's done. Yeah. And maybe it's done and in the trash, or maybe it's done and I want to show it to people.
I feel like for me also, like once it goes in a book, like I'm done.
Yeah.
I've sort of made the pact to myself that, because like Canal, I feel like I could keep revising for years and years, but like who I am today in 2019 is different than the person I was in 2012 when that poem was finished. And to go back and change that feels like a betrayal of who the person I was then. That person did the very best he could on that day, and the poem went out into the world and it got picked up and blah blah blah, and like who am I, to go back and kind of like trample over what he did or couldn't do.
I love that. Like, I love that so much. I never really thought about it that way, but like, yeah, I totally like, yeah, why would I go back and tell 20-year-old me, like, you did bad? No. And I think, done doesn't have to mean perfect. Like, and there's that cliche that perfect is the enemy of done, and I did not always believe that, but now I'm a big believer, and perfect is the enemy of done. And then, so, I think it's done once I've gotten to the point where I'm like, I've said what I needed to say.
Have you, any of you, experimented with trying to be a lyricist and was that successful, or did you learn anything by doing that?
So the poet Nathan Brown, I went to a talk that he did, and he used to be a songwriter in Nashville. And Nathan Brown was the poet laureate of Oklahoma, and now he's based out of Wimberley. And he was a lyricist for years in Nashville. And he said, writing country and pop songs is way harder than being a poet, because the constraints for a sellable country song are way more severe than even the most hardest formal poetry constraints. So I have not tried it, but I do not feel inspired to after that.
Yeah, I think the formal constraints are really daunting.
So I think that is all we have. Please give our panelists a warm round of applause.
This has been the Writers League of Texas podcast. For more information about the Writers League of Texas and our many programs and services for writers, visit our website at writersleague.org. Email us at wlt@writersleague.org or give us a call at 512-499-8914. Thank you for listening.